Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, free agency starts today. Today we'll preview free agency for the Timberwolves, as well as a quick primer on the Wolves roster, the cap situation, the decisions they've made so far this week, and also the big decision they have today on Jordan McLaughlin. How many roster spots, what kind of dollars the Wolves have available, and then what I think they should do in terms of prioritizing potential free agency additions. We're going to break it all down on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Happy Friday, everybody. Happy weekend and happy start. NBA free agency, a big day today. First of all, though, a big thank you to our title sponsor of the show, Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, Locked On Wolves is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch the show on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken. That's with two B's, two E's, C-K-E-N. All right. Today on the show, of course, the NBA free agency period starts this afternoon. The official open is 5 p.m. Central Time, and the Timberwolves have been making moves throughout the week related to their own roster. So I want to quickly hit on where we stand as of right now, Friday morning on June 30th, and then, what happens as we get into this free agency period, what the Wolves' options are, and then I want to talk some actual players. We don't know what's going to happen over the weekend, of course, but I want to get into a handful of players, a couple of which I've talked about on the show before, a couple of whom have been rumored that the Wolves have been rumored to be interested in recent days in various corners of the internet. So we'll cover all those players on the show today. And then if anything major breaks over the weekend, of course, we'll do a show if the Wolves make a significant move. And then also on Friday afternoon, if the Wolves do anything at all, really, we'll do some sort of a video that'll get posted to YouTube and actually probably audio too. So it'll be a quicker segment if it's something more minor, but all that to say, I'll be at top of everything this weekend. And then of course, break everything down on Monday, regardless of what happens here over the next few days. So let's start with where the Wolves currently sit, what the Wolves have done so far this week. And of course, we talked about this one the other day. I think this was Wednesday. The Timberwolves officially waived Taurean Prince, allowing him to, he had about 7.5 or so, 7.5-ish million that would have been guaranteed if they hadn't waived him for next year. The Wolves let him go. I had thought that was kind of a 50-50 move until they re-signed Naz Reid, or extended Naz Reid on Sunday, which then I thought kind of swung things a little bit more towards it being more likely that they just wanted to save some additional space and let Prince go. John Krasinski of The Athletic has reported, and this makes a ton of sense, the Wolves would still be potentially interested in bringing Prince back. I'm sure this is one of those hey, let's see how the market shakes out. We like Taurean Prince. He's a great locker room influence. He was arguably the best shooter on the team last year with Towns' injury, most consistent shooter. Even if there's some shortcomings defensively, rebounding, etc., the intangibles are good, the shooting's good, and they need to backfill that position anyway, right? So Taurean Prince could be back, but the Wolves are going to look for a more efficient use of cap space. So we know Taurean Prince is an unrestricted free agent. The Wolves also decided to not extend the qualifying offer, I should say, to Nickeil Alexander-Walker. Basically, what that means, as a restricted free agent, if the Wolves had submitted the qualifying offer, they'd be on the hook essentially for a 1-year, $7-ish million deal, $7+ million, if he doesn't sign somewhere else. Now that they have decided to not tender the offer, he's an unrestricted free agent. The Wolves still do hold his bird rights, which isn't, I don't think, super relevant for Alexander-Walker. But basically, the Wolves, this has been reported in lots of places, the Wolves would love to bring back Alexander-Walker. He's going to be cheaper than Taurean Prince. And the thought process is hey, rather than 1 year, $7 million, could we maybe bring him back at 2 years, $10 million or something like that? Could the average annual value that Alexander-Walker gets be lower than what the qualifying offer would have been? The Wolves were willing to risk letting him go to then bring him back on, again, a more efficient deal, right? A more cost-efficient deal, I guess is a better way to say that. So Alexander Walker, I think at this point, it's going to depend on some of the guys that talk about here in a minute, whether or not he's back. Outside free agents, it seems like the team really wants him back based on everything we've heard and the exit interviews with Tim Connolly and Chris Finch. I said this on Twitter on Friday morning. I worry a little bit about the recency bias of how he played against Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and for most of the series against Jamal Murray, obviously until the final, game 5 when Jamal Murray went off. Alexander Walker is a good defender. He's a versatile defender. The idea of him, though, I think is a little better than the results we've seen over the 4 years of his career. He's been spotty. There's a reason he's been traded 3 times. He just hasn't been consistent. Now he's still young. He still has those physical gifts, the talents to do it. The shot hasn't really improved a lot either. If you could tell me he improves his 3-point shot by a couple 3 percentage points and he's a consistent defender, absolutely. 2 years, 10 million, 2 years, even 12 million. I think it's absolutely worth bringing him back because that's the role the Wolves need, is a 3-and-D guy, a versatile defender, switchable defender. I just worry that the recency bias and the whole attitude of like, oh, let's keep our guys, let's run it back. Like, I think we're getting ahead of speaking in like massive generalities. I don't know for sure that the Wolves want to do that, but all the reporting and especially a lot of the local reporting is like, let's get him back. And I don't know. I think sometimes collectively, and sometimes myself too, we get caught up in the like, let's keep the same guys. And the idea of him is better than the actual player. That said, if the Wolves in a week end up back with Alexander Walker at 2 years, 10 million, don't come to me and say, hey, Ben, I thought, don't act like you're happy about this. That might end up being a good deal. We just don't know how everything else plays out. Like, I could say one thing now and dependent, like we've seen this every year. Remember the year like 10 years ago when Timothy Mozgov signed like a 4-year, $44 million deal or something crazy. I think it was the Clippers. It was just absurd. Was it the Clippers? I don't know. I think it was. But like those sorts of things happen and it kind of breaks the market, right? So we don't know how this is going to shake out. If some of the guys I talk about later get twice what I think they're going to get, then Alexander Walker at 2 years and 10 million might actually be a pretty good deal, right? We just don't know yet. But sitting here right now, I think the Wolves could do better for that dollar amount or for that salary slot, if you will. So my preference at the moment would be to fill that role with somebody else. Smaller decisions. Nate Knight, the team option was declined. That was a mild surprise to me. But again, the trend after extending Nas and waiving Prince, perhaps that was more likely. I had kind of penciled him in as back next year because the Wolves need big man depth and he was like under $2 million. And so I just figured like, hey, he'll be back. It's like 1.9. It was essentially $2 million. And he still may be back. It's just the Wolves want to retain as much flexibility as they can going into the actual free agency period. So Nate Knight is an unrestricted free agent now because the team declined the option that they had on him. They also extended qualifying offers to their two-way players. So the restricted free agents, Luka Garza and Matt Ryan, those are both, again, qualifying offers as two-way players. So it's a little bit different. Long story short, they could both re-sign as two-way players because they were first-time two-way players. So one or both of them could be back. We just don't know. Jordan McLaughlin, the decision's today. So by the time you're listening to this, perhaps they've already made that announcement. I'm assuming the deadline is later in the afternoon. I'm leaning towards them. Initially, I came into the offseason saying like, hey, if you can get a backup point guard for $2.3 million, that's not bad. And based on the way he played in October and November of last year, that's an absolute bargain, an absolute steal. But the way that he played after the calf injury and the fact that he was basically out of the rotation at the end of the season and in the playoffs, you could do better for a backup point guard, right? So what do the Wolves believe? Do they let him go, save the money now and say like, let's consolidate at, $2 million at a time, whatever we can to sign somebody for a little over the minimum plus use the mid-level exception or whatever. And we can always come back to Jordan McLaughlin. That's a risk, right? Because somebody could say, hey, we'll take J-Mac for $2.5 million or whatever. But then the counter is you could find a backup point guard that's as good or better than McLaughlin was at the end of last season for the same price or less, right? For a vet minimum deal. So I'm leaning towards it being more likely at this point they let him go, that they waive Jordan McLaughlin and always have the fallback of bringing him back. That's different than how I felt about this a week ago, to be clear. So I think it's probably more likely than not that at the end of the day, McLaughlin's a free agent and the Wolves save that salary spot, save that roster spot to use elsewhere. That's today's decision point, though. It's Jordan McLaughlin. So if they let him go, then the Wolves essentially will only have 8 guys under contract. Well, no, I guess it'd be, if you include the rookies, they would essentially have 10 guys. So they need to fill, 5 roster spots. You got the two-way guys in there. I'm ballparking it. I may be off by a spot, but you'd be saving the roster. Prince's spot is open. Alexander Walker's spot is open. Knight's is open, and then potentially McLaughlin's, and then the two ways. So you'd have between 4 and 6, depending on how you want to count the two ways, spots to fill going into free agency. And I want to talk about some targets here next. The Wolves will have the full mid-level exception to use. They don't have much else, right? Depending on what they do with McLaughlin, they may have a little bit of cash above vet minimum deals. But I'm going to talk about a bunch of names that are not vet minimum guys and prioritizing them. I'll list them off basically based on how I would prioritize them. There's a couple names that will take the full mid-level and potentially more, meaning they may have priced themselves, or they may be priced outside the Wolves' range. So we'll talk about all that here next. Some names to look out for as we head into free agency on Friday. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at Prize Picks. Prize Picks is the absolute most fun way to play daily fantasy. If you're not familiar, it's really, really easy to play Prize Picks. You just pick 2 to 6 players if they'll score more or less than their projected, than their Prize Picks projection, and you can win up to 25 times your money on your entry. You're not competing against other people either, which if you play other DFS, you perhaps are. The quote unquote pro DFS players. That's not what you're doing with Prize Picks. It's their projections versus you. They offer projections on any sport that you watch, like literally anything. I mean, up to like overseas basketball, boxing, MMA, disc golf's on there. And of course, more mainstream sports, if you will, like baseball, WNBA, college sports, etc., is all on there as well. So head over to Prize Picks. You can make your entry in less than 60 seconds. Just download the Prize Picks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code Locked On. If you deposit $100, Prize Picks will give you $100. If you deposit $50, they'll give you $50. Don't forget to enter the promo code Locked On at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. A big thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, everydayers, we're still daily Monday through Friday throughout the month of July as we get into free agency period, summer league, break down the roster, any moves that they make. Remember, last year's first week of July, the Wolves traded for Rudy Gobert. So anything could happen this month. As I said earlier, we will do a quick, if the Wolves do anything this afternoon, we'll do likely a live, or I don't know if it'll be live, but an interview with Locked On folks. We'll post it to audio and video feed on YouTube. And then if there's anything major, obviously like a cat trade or which again, unlikely, and officially can't happen until like July 8th or whatever anyway. But if anything like that were to happen, any real rumors, or if the Wolves use a full mid-level on a bigger name, like somebody we're going to talk about here in a minute, we'll probably do a full show this weekend to talk about it. Otherwise, we'll be back Monday and again daily throughout next week as well. All right, let's talk about some free agency targets. A couple of these guys I've talked about on the show before. I want to start with the name that I hadn't talked about that came up this week in a couple of different places as a name the Wolves would be interested in. I forget who first mentioned it. John Krasinski at The Athletic did in his article, but I don't believe he was the first one. I think somebody nationally said the Wolves could have interest in Dante DiVincenzo, of course, most recently of the Golden State Warriors. And I don't hate the idea. I think he seems to be, just kind of based on surveying the Twitter masses, which is dangerous, but also the comment sections, etc., in a variety of places. Also much more dangerous, actually. Seems to be a fairly polarizing player. I like Dante DiVincenzo. I think he is a solid player. I mean, obviously, he's played in a couple of winning teams, winning a championship in Milwaukee and playing with Golden State this last year. Signed a very team-friendly deal with the player option. He signed a 2-year, $9 million deal with Golden State last summer and made $4.5 million this year. Declined the player option for $4.7 million. So he obviously thinks he can get more than $5 million a year in free agency. And that's kind of the trick with DiVincenzo is he's not a full mid-level exception player. So to be clear, and I mentioned this in the first segment, the Wolves have the full mid-level, which is $12.4 million. So they could use that on one of the guys I'm going to talk about here in a minute, or they could split it up and sign some of these middle-of-the-road type contract guys. So one path is the Wolves could sign a DiVincenzo and then sign another player who I mentioned the other day, and I'll talk about again here in a minute, like a Javon Carter. Now, there's some overlap there, so I don't know that you really need to sign both of them. Like, I don't think both DiVincenzo and Javon Carter end up on the Wolves this offseason. But you could split it up and that sort of thing, right? Like a couple of guys that are in the Nickeil Alexander-Walker. So you could go DiVincenzo, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, some overlap there in terms of positional overlap, but you could essentially DiVincenzo he's not really a point guard, but he could essentially run your offense off the bench. I think more likely it's like Javon Carter and Alexander Walker or something like that, where you give one of these guys $5 or $6 million, the other guy $5 or $6 million or $4 million, and then you have room for one other player, right? That's how the Wolves could slice and dice this. And DiVincenzo is a name that I hadn't talked about previously, so I wanted to talk briefly about him. So the pedigree's good in terms of where he's played. What he brings in terms of shooting is positive. He's a career 36% three-point shooter. Now, this last year, he was just a shade under 40%. He had never been above, he had 138% year in Milwaukee, but then he had 3 seasons where he was 34% or worse from 3. And then this last year, he all of a sudden was 39.7% in Golden State. So if that's real, I mean, worst case, he's probably league average-ish, right? 36, 37%, which is very passable. He's a little undersized to just play the true 2 guard. He's like 6'4", but he can initiate a little bit of offense. He's had nice assist rates wherever he's been. And he's also pretty good defensively. Again, a little undersized, but a solid defender. I think of him more as a combo guard. Again, he really is kind of a catch and shoot 3-point guy at this point. But he does a little bit of everything. He's actually, for his size, he's not a bad rebounder. He's not like going to save you there. But I mean, like compared to some of the guys Wolves like, and this is, by the way, you wouldn't normally think to be like, what's the rebound rate of this guard the Wolves are looking at signing? That's important when you're as bad at rebounding as the Timberwolves have been. Dante DiVincenzo is 6'4" and played the 2 guard for most of last year with Golden State, but his rebound rate would have ranked very highly on the Timberwolves. Last season, a 9.4 for his career, 9.9% rebound rate. That would have ranked ahead of Anthony Edwards and everyone else in the Timberwolves backcourt last year. Every single other player. The only players with a better rebound rate, Rudy Gobert, Karl-Anthony Towns, Kyle Anderson, and then, all the bigs that played, Garza and Minot, guys didn't play that many minutes. He would have been the best rebounding guard or wing on the Timberwolves, better than Edwards, better than Jaden McDaniels, better than Nickeil Alexander-Walker, better than Taurean Prince, much better than Taurean Prince. So now part of that's a philosophy and how you rebound, like how you crash the glass or don't crash the glass, etc. But like that's something that is important when we're looking at all these players. So DiVincenzo checks a lot of the boxes: a solid defender, a solid shooter, a good rebounder for his size, can initiate some offense, and fills that quote unquote Jalen Noel role where he's the backup 2 off the bench, can provide a little bit of instant offense. He's not as ball dominant as Jalen Noel, but he can initiate a little bit and he can catch and shoot, and he's a much better defender. So I like DiVincenzo. I wouldn't give him, like, he's not getting the full mid level. And if the Wolves did that, I would really like to know what the rest of the market looks like. To me, he's a 5-6, maybe $7 million player. I like him more than Nickeil Alexander-Walker. I know Alexander-Walker in theory is a better defender. I don't know that it's true in practice. I also think the Wolves have other guys that could play that role, and DiVincenzo wouldn't be the only player you're adding either, right? So I like DiVincenzo as an add. I think at 5-6, even $7 million, that's a nice addition. And I'd be 100% on board with adding Dante DiVincenzo to the Timberwolves. Kind of in that same realm in terms of a mid to high level, Bruce Brown, I think, is probably going to be on the higher end of the mid level. I doubt he gets the full $12.4 million from somebody, but he opted out of $6.8 million from Denver. So he's probably going to be in the 8 to 10 or more million. Now, I think it's worth it. If the Wolves have a shot at getting Bruce Brown for $10 million and say Javon Carter for 3, well, that's not quite how that would work. If they could get Bruce Brown for 9 and Javon Carter for 3, sign me up right now. That's maybe my best case scenario for this offseason. Bruce Brown, I've talked a lot about him on the show last offseason. I wanted the Wolves to sign him when he was a free agent coming out of Brooklyn. The Wolves went after him. Denver got him on that 2-year deal with the player option. And then he was a huge part of their championship this year. Career highs in a lot of areas, was actually down a little bit shooting the ball, but he's a solid 3-point shooter, a really good defender, can play the 2 and the 3. Can even initiate some offense, can play a little point forward, essentially, if you want him to. He's 6'4", 6'5". I love Bruce Brown. He would be my number 1 free agency target, but I don't spend a lot of time talking about him because a lot of other teams are after him, including Denver, and every other contender is going to want Bruce Brown, essentially. So I think it's unlikely, but my number 1 scenario would be Bruce Brown and Javon Carter. And, you let McLaughlin go. Javon Carter's your backup 2. Bruce Brown is off the bench along with, backup 1 for Javon Carter. Bruce Brown, Kyle Anderson, Naz Reid are your backups, your top rotation guys off the bench. That's a good team. That's a really good team. So I'd go hard after Bruce Brown. He's going to cost more than DiVincenzo, to be clear. Another guy who maybe is more in the DiVincenzo range and maybe even a little bit less would be Torrey Craig. He's a little bit older. Tim Connolly ties, of course, as starting his career at Denver. I think he was undrafted, but played in Denver his first 3+ seasons. And then has been on some contenders, right? He was with Milwaukee. He's been with Phoenix. Phoenix has had him a couple of different times. More of a depth play, but I do think he gets, he was a rotation guy again last year for Phoenix after having been in and out of the rotation a couple years prior. He's a solid kind of 3-and-D-ish player. He's not like he's fine defensively. I think he's, a little bit, I think he's a plus defensively. He's a bigger forward, a bigger wing. He's going to rebound a little bit for you. He's not going to initiate any offense. So he doesn't check all the boxes. And I think he's more of like a 9th guy than he is like a 7th guy in your rotation, if you will. So I wouldn't prioritize Torrey Craig, but I think the experience and what he brings from a size perspective, rebounding perspective would be valuable. So he kind of fits in that mid-range for me as well. But I would rank him certainly after Bruce Brown and DiVincenzo. I also think he makes a little bit less money than each of those guys. All right, let's close the show by talking about full mid-level guys and then circling back to Jevon Carter and what my ideal scenarios. There's a couple. I already talked about the Bruce Brown, Jevon Carter scenario, but how else could the Wolves kind of piecemeal this offseason together or this free agency period together? So we'll get to all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors of the show, and that is our friends at Game Time. If you've ever delayed on buying tickets to any event, not just sports, but concerts, theater, whatever it might be, then Game Time is the best place for you to buy tickets. And I am guilty of procrastinating a lot on a lot of things, but especially buying tickets. Buying tickets to your favorite events should not be stressful. Game Time is the place for last-minute ticket deals. Forget planning months in advance. Game Time has deals on tickets right up to the day of the event. Get exclusive flash deals on tickets for football, basketball, baseball, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. The Game Time guarantee means you'll always get the best price. If you find tickets in the same section or row for less, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. It's the fastest growing ticketing app in the country for a reason. Get images of your seats before you buy so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. Buy tickets in a matter of seconds, 2 taps, and you're all set. Tickets are sent directly to your phone so you never have to dig through your email. Snag your tickets without the stress with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. All right, let's wrap up this free agency primer with some targets that I would look at for the full mid-level. Now, I think a couple of these guys will probably get more than that. The Wolves have not been connected at all, at least not that I've seen, to Seth Curry. I talked about him last week. I think it was last week. Seth Curry would be a top target for me. And he probably will get more than the full mid-level, but I don't know that for sure. And if the Wolves got Seth Curry and then were able to add a couple of vet minimums that we felt good about, I'm open to that. He's that good of a sixth man type that I think you can get away with doing that. And he adds that level of shooting that you could, he comes off the bench most likely for the Wolves, almost certainly, but then you can play him in your closing lineup. If you need that offense, you could play him with Anthony Edwards. He's a career 43.5% 3-point shooter. He was 40.5% last year. He's been over 45%, 4 seasons in his 8-ish year career. He is exactly the type of guy, he's older now, right? He's early 30s. He's going to be 33 this year. He's not a great defender, but I think that shoot skill is good enough still for Seth Curry that you pay him $12 million and you figure it out. You have Jaden McDaniels, you have Anthony Edwards. You'll find a couple of guys in vet minimum deals. I'm not going to dig really deep into that today because that's going to be a next week conversation. But you can fill out the roster with vet minimum guys, and the Wolves need shooting so badly. And we talk the Wolves let Taurean Prince go. He's a 39+% 3-point shooter last year. And this Wolves team, they ended up 13th in shooting percentage league-wide, but they struggled the first part of the year. And of course, that's going to be fixed a large deal by having Karl-Anthony Towns healthy. But they need more shooting to spread the floor for Ant and Kat and Rudy. So I would be completely open to paying $12 million for Seth Curry. It's maybe not my first choice, but I'd be open to it. Another player that the Wolves have been, there was a rumor out there. I think it was like a reputable source, but the idea of Karis LeVert to the Wolves was floated. I don't think the Wolves would be able to afford LeVert. I wouldn't break the bank for him either. By that, I mean, I wouldn't pay the full mid-level. I think somebody will, and I think he might get more than that. That's a name to keep an eye on because of it makes sense from a positional standpoint. But obviously, the LeVert injury history is disappointing because he was coming into his own before the injuries. But I just wouldn't. I'd rather have Seth Curry at that money. Other names to look out for: Gabe Vincent, Max Strus, of course, both former members of the Miami Heat. Those guys are going to get paid too, probably 10 plus million each. I wouldn't pay 10 plus million for either one of them. If I'm going to use the full mid level, the only name that's out there that I think is realistic that I like is Seth Curry. Vincent and Strus to me are not worth that. They're probably going to get more anyway. They both fill part of a need, right? Like the Wolves need a backup point guard. Gabe Vincent would fit great there. He's got the pedigree. He's not quite the shooter that you want him to be, but he's a solid defender. I don't know. Like he's fine, but like he's not worth what he's going to get paid because of the reputation he has for being in Miami the last 4 years. Max Strus, Strus, for some reason, I always want to say Struss, and then I get stuck partway through. But Max Strus, like again, good player, good shooter, not like a great shooter. I know a couple years ago he was over 40%, but he's only 35% this year, and like 3/4 of his shots are from three. Like I get that he played a big role in the postseason. I'd like him to be a better rebounder for his size. I'd like him to be a better defender. Again, it's the Miami thing. I think somebody's going to pay him more in the recency bias of the playoffs. He's going to get paid more than he is worth. So I would not be excited about Gabe Vincent or Max Strus for the full mid-level. And I'll feel that way if that happens. And I don't think it will. I think each of them will actually get overpaid in free agency. So I come back to my ideal scenario. Jevon Carter, real quickly, is my favorite value free agent target because I think he's one of the best backup point guards in the league. He actually started almost half the season for Milwaukee this year, the best team in the league record-wise for a good chunk of the season. And he is a career 39.7% three-point shooter, 42% this year. So he's a career 40% three-point shooter. Yeah, he had a small role before this year, but he's always been a rotation-ish guy, really, since partway through his rookie year with Memphis. And he's 40% for his career from three. He's a plus defender, a really, really good defender. He's a solid rebounder for a point guard. Again, that's not why you're signing him, but he's solid there. To me, he's the fully realized version of Jordan McLaughlin. He's a little bigger than J-Mac, but he is the better version of Jordan McLaughlin, and he's got the experience. He's come off the bench and started. To me, he's the guy that I'm targeting as he might get paid twice, but like his contract that he opted out of, or I guess he's a free agent anyway, but his contract that he was on, he opted out, was essentially the same as Jordan McLaughlin. I think he probably gets $4 or $5 million, but if I could get, if I could get Bruce Brown for, call it $8.5 million, I think he's probably gonna get more than that. But if I get him for $8.5 million and I could get Jevon Carter for $3.5 million, that's the ideal offseason. I think probably both of them get more than that. So that's a really tough thing to try and do. I think DiVincenzo and Jevon Carter overlap a little because I think DiVincenzo is a little undersized. He's not really going to guard that many threes for you successfully. And I think you need that role that the Wolves are trying to backfill. So the combination, right? The three positions the Wolves have to fill are Noel, Alexander Walker, and Taurean Prince. Those guys are all gone, at least at the moment. None of them are on the Wolves roster, and they have to fill those three roles. So the offensive Jalen Noel, the positional, that combo guard, backup point, backup two, also if Jordan McLaughlin's gone, the defensive role of Alexander Walker and Taurean Prince, and the shooting of Taurean Prince. So how do you fill those 3 to 4 roles with $12 million? Well, you don't. You're going to need the vet minimum to do it too. But what's the best way to splice that up? And that's the question the Wolves are trying to answer Friday afternoon and throughout the weekend and into next week. I think the best case scenario is what I just said, is like Bruce Brown and Jevon Carter, but that's maybe pie in the sky. Next best is maybe Alexander Walker, Jevon Carter, and then you have a little bit left over to try and find somebody for above the vet minimum. Maybe it's bringing back Taurean Prince, but I think he's going to get more than that. It might be still bringing back Jordan McLaughlin at a vet minimum deal, maybe Austin Rivers. Those are possibilities, but I like the idea of, love the idea of Bruce Brown. The most realistic thing that I think the Wolves could do is DiVincenzo bring back Jordan McLaughlin and, find another wing. Maybe it's Torrey Craig, somebody that's going to get $5 or $6 million. That I'd be okay with that. Right. But my priority would be trying to split that mid-level between Javon Carter and a wing that can do one of those things that you're looking for, whether it's Torrey Craig, who can be your tough-nosed, bigger wing, like a Taurean Prince type role. He's not quite the shooter that Taurean Prince is, but I think he does enough of that and brings enough of what TP did at a lower salary, and you get Javon Carter to upgrade your backup point guard spot. I think that's a really nice way to come out of this offseason. Maybe it's DiVincenzo and Torrey Craig and bring back McLaughlin. And DiVincenzo and McLaughlin kind of split those. DiVincenzo, again, he's not a point guard, but he can initiate some offense. So maybe it's DiVincenzo and Ant together kind of running the second unit. Maybe it's Jordan McLaughlin is back and he's your backup point guard. DiVincenzo plays next to him. So you get DiVincenzo, Craig, and Jordan McLaughlin. It's some combination of Javon Carter, DiVincenzo, Torrey Craig, hopefully Bruce Brown, and then the guys that are currently free agents, Taurean Prince and potentially Jordan McLaughlin. That's what the Wolves are trying to do. The full mid-level option for me, Seth Curry is the only one that I like, unless there's somebody I'm completely missing. So, I mean, if I didn't mention somebody, hit me up on Twitter and we'll talk about it, on Monday for sure. If there's anybody still out there that I'm missing. And of course I'll reply on Twitter. We can have the conversation there, but it's such a weird position the Wolves are in because they can't make any major moves short of trading Karl-Anthony Towns, which we've talked about plenty on the show. Everything else is just trying to cobble this together within this smaller, more finite amount of dollars. So all that to say, really interesting situation on Friday and throughout the weekend. We'll be with you throughout the weekend on Twitter. If anything big happens, we'll do a short show, or if anything happens, we'll do a short show, like a less than 10 minutes clip. And if anything major happens, I'll do a full emergency pod this weekend as well. Otherwise, we'll see you Monday. We'll be daily again next week. That's all we have for you. Otherwise, though, today, big thank you for watching and listening and for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show's free and available everywhere. You can watch it on YouTube as well as the Locked On Sports Minnesota app, and you can listen wherever you like to listen to podcasts. You can follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken. That's with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.